Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the RAS Picks YouTube channel. It is NFL Divisional Weekend, one of my favorite weekends of the entire year. Good to see folks in here for the live stream as we get going here on a Wednesday evening. To everybody listening on Apple or Spotify on the Simple Handicap podcast feed, appreciate you for tuning in as we're down to the third to last podcast and live stream of the NFL season. 7 games to go. That's the good news. That's the bad news. It's been a long season for everybody. We're looking forward to winding down with a few great games this weekend as we head into the Super Bowl. On this video, I'm going to talk about every single game, all the sides, all the totals. I will give a score prediction for each game as well. We'll dive into certain topics that I think are going to have an impact on the outcome of the games on Saturday and Sunday, and try to give you all the information that I can to help you make the best decision possible when it comes to betting on the games this weekend. We have some excited viewers, including Gerard Morris, a longtime viewer here on the channel. Nice, a live broadcast that isn't in the middle of the night for East Coast fans. I might be replacing some typical primetime television here on a Wednesday evening, but I'm trying to do a lot of different time slots, experiment with different things, and get going. So it's good to have you live back on another live stream, Gerard, as well. J.O. saying, thank you for all your hard work this season. Thank you for tuning in to so many of the shows and the podcasts as well. GLB Bets is pumped because he's watching and says, perfect timing while making dinner. Let's find some winners. Joe English says, good afternoon. Jay Nava just woke up from a nap, 4:09 p.m. What a great time to wake up from a nap as well. And Michael's pumped too. Yes, finally catching a live. He says, Vince Vegas already throwing bets in the chat, taking Chiefs and Lions in a tease. Also can be done with Ohio State. He says, thank me later. The emphasis on already winning the bet is being showcased in the chat as well. And Mike is tuning in from Austin, Texas. So, Mike, I have a question. I'm going to go back and forth in the chat with you as we go here. Where is Franklin Barbecue worth the trip down? It's on number 1 on my list of places to go to eat. It's something I really aspire to do. I want to be there at 3 in the morning. I want to be there with a cooler and the lawn chair. I want to wait for 8 hours and enjoy the atmosphere and then spend an obscene amount of money on meat for the chance of having what is deemed to be the best brisket and the best barbecue in the entire world. I've heard alternative opinions on it. I want your expertise, being from Austin as well. DT's saying, good morning. I don't know where you're tuning in from, but must be perhaps down under, if I'm guessing right as well. Adams, he's already commenting in the chat. Terry Black's barbecue is goated, so that's big as well. Julian's tuning in from South Florida. Good to see. So Terry Black's versus Franklin. I love Joe's in Kansas City at the gas station. That was fantastic. But I want to know, is Franklin's worth the trip? So let me know in the chat as we get going. Here we go. Game number 1, Saturday afternoon. Houston on the road at the Kansas City Chiefs. Chiefs 8.5-point favorites with a total of 41. My score prediction is shown in the banner. Kansas City 26, Houston 17. I do think it is a game where the Chiefs have a bigger lead at the half and then perhaps ease into the fourth quarter, I don't want to say foot off the gas, but it's a big game looming for them if they're in control coming up next week. This is a big game, obviously, for both teams. But with that AFC Championship looming, I think if the Chiefs are in control, we don't see them foot on the gas in the fourth quarter. So 26-17 is my score prediction. Now, new to the live stream, because there's only 4 games, the guy has a little bit more time to maneuver during the week. We have graphics for the show to go along with everything that we're looking at. So this is going to be fun for everybody watching live. If you're on the podcast feed, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know. But if there's any graphics you want to check out, you can watch it on YouTube as well. So I want to start off with the big talking point that I have for this game, and that is, what is the true offensive rating for Kansas City? So here is the end of season market ratings that we are looking at for the Chiefs specifically. And for those of you watching on a phone or a TV, you can see in the 1, 2, 3, 4th column from the left, Kansas City finished the season with an offensive power rating of 18th. They were rated 0.1 points worse than an average team on offense. And I think this is something that may not be being fully priced into the Chiefs' futures numbers, nor the Chiefs' week-to-week numbers that we might see specifically this week and maybe for the next 2 games if they carry on in the playoffs. And the reason that I bring this up is because I look at the Chiefs' offense coming into the playoffs is a completely different offense than what we saw over the course of the season. Here's a few reasons why. As we can see, 45 snaps with Pacheco, Brown, and Hopkins together on the field. If we think about what this Chiefs offense was supposed to be coming into the season, there was so much optimism around all the pieces that they have. And this was going to be a unit that finally came together for Mahomes, and they suffered the injuries early. Brown went down. They lost Rice. They lost Pacheco. They added Hopkins early in the season. But we haven't seen these guys play together, aside from the final 2 games of the season where they combined for 45 snaps together on the field. So we think about that Chiefs offensive rating of minus 0.1 versus an average team 18th. What does it look like when everybody is on the field together? That's the big question that we don't have the answer to. In the 2 games that everyone was together on the field, they combined during those snaps for 5.97 yards per play. Comparatively, in the 14 weeks prior with either a combo or none of those guys on the field, the Chiefs offense finished 5.05 yards per play. So it's nearly 1 yard per play better in the very small sample size that we have seen with those guys on the field. And that could be something that continues to develop as we get into the playoffs. And the reason I think there's optimism that the ceiling might be a little bit higher than that number that is listed is because we have seen the Chiefs over the career of Patrick Mahomes perform to a much higher and elevated level in the playoffs. Some speculation is that the Chiefs save the good plays for the playoffs. We've heard Andy Reid uses the good plays when it matters most. There's a lot of discussions about why that might be. I think there's some truth to that in combination with this year, obviously getting guys back. But I also believe that part of the Chiefs offense this season, and perhaps some of the underperformance, especially when it comes to covering numbers and winning by margin, could be due to the schedule that they faced. So many times the Chiefs were playing 3 games in so many days and reduced schedules and playing on different days and altered timeframes. How much has that impacted prep? And how much has that impacted perhaps game planning and putting together an optimal game plan that maximizes the offense on a week-to-week basis when so much of the schedule and the routine is altered? Coming into this week, it's 24 days rest for the majority of the team. So not only is everybody healthy, not only is the prep not disrupted, not only is there extra time where we know Reid has been excellent, but there's this heightened level of playoff expectations for the Chiefs that I think is fair to look at as a playoff bump for this offense. In the career of Patrick Mahomes, the Kansas City Chiefs have averaged 6.35 yards per play in the playoffs. Only once during the regular season, which is in the record-setting 2018 season, where they actually better in the regular season on a per-play basis than they were in the playoffs. And as far as the rust factor goes, when we're thinking about these teams off of long rest, perhaps starting slow, I don't think that applies at all for the Kansas City Chiefs in this matchup. In the playoffs, their first half average is 17.5 points scored. They've got off to very quick starts game after game that they've played in the playoffs. They've outscored opponents 17.5 to 11 in that first half. And what's really standing out to me when I think about Chiefs playoff performances and these fast starts, they haven't had a first drive punt in a playoff game since the 2021 wild card game. They continue to find ways to get down the field early in playoff games. They continue to find ways to get points on the board early in playoff games. And in some cases, we have seen them ease up a little bit in the second half. I just don't think that's the case this week with so many guys healthy, so many guys rested, so many guys refreshed, and so much extra time to prep. I really don't buy into this Chiefs offensive rating at 18th. I think the ceiling is considerably higher, and we might see that show through in this game specifically. Now, to wrap up, just kind of thoughts I have on the other side. The Chiefs defense, since Amenahu returned, has shown a much stronger pass rush, and it's kind of freed things up at multiple levels. I think that matters against the Texans' offensive line. And as we see, Jalen Watson, cornerback number 2 for this team, has a good chance of returning in this game. I think Reid kind of threw a bit of cold water on things with his presser this week, where he was saying he's not sure if he can play a full game yet, and they're judging things on how it goes this week. So the big optimism earlier in the weekend, going back a few days, about Watson playing the full game, I think has dampened a little bit. But when I think about Amenahu with time to rest, with perhaps Watson coming back, with pass rushers like Chris Jones getting healthier in time to rest, I think it's all a net positive for this Chiefs defense. And matched up against the Texans offensive line, that could be very problematic for Houston trying to move the football consistently. So to me, this is a game that Kansas City can win. I think the number now that it's been bet out, is right in the right neighborhood. Perhaps we're still seeing earlier markets in the game a little bit undervalued. There was a very influential group that typically bets late in the week come in much earlier than expected and play back Houston as this number was drifting out a little bit further earlier this morning. And so that makes me think a little bit different about this spread, but it all comes down to, do the Chiefs pull off in the fourth quarter with the game coming up on deck? And so that is how I look at the Houston Texans on the road at the Kansas City Chiefs. Michael B says, it's going to be a biblical show when there are graphics. Well, here's the thing. 4 games, a little bit extra time. I would love to have graphics for every game. And honestly, next year, I'm thinking about condensing things a little bit for the live stream because I think they help and I think they add some value to it. And so the graphics come out in the playoffs, late in the playoffs. We saw it last year as well. And hopefully they help. You guys let me know in the chat. Does it help as well with what we're looking at too? Changing 500. I did not know they were live at this time. That's my mistake. And so both shows worth watching. Wasn't intentional on my part. I actually feel a little bit bad about that. I would encourage everybody to watch both if you're looking at that. Mike is saying that Franklin's brisket is worth every minute of the waiting you'll do. I almost feel like the wait sets up the meal to a higher standard. Like the wait makes the experience better. I say the same thing about beer. I think you can have a bad beer in a good region or a good time in a certain part of the world, and it tastes different. I always equate it to having a Presidente in the Dominican Republic. That tastes so much different than having one in Saskatoon. I mean, it's just not the same. And I think that's the same with barbecue and brisket and stuff like that as well. When you're in the environment and you have the wait, it's going to be different. So I'm glad to hear your endorsement, Mike, as a local Austin resident, to hear that Franklin's brisket is worth the trip as well. Rogers Pump, live in color. There we go. Good to have you here on a live stream as well. Let's keep going to the next game as we look at the Washington Commanders on the road at the Detroit Lions. Lions 9.5-point favorites with a total of 55. My score prediction here: Detroit 33, Commanders 23. Some great talking points on this game specifically. First one I want to bring up, and this was sent out in a good tweet by TA earlier. I hope everybody follows TA on Twitter, and I'll expand on things a little bit further. And this is going to be focused on the advantage that Jared Goff has against man coverage specifically. On the course of the season, Jared Goff is number 1 in EPA per play, completion percentage, and yards per attempt when facing man coverage. Washington this season defensively plays the 6th highest rate of man coverage. And I want to quickly just jump back to this graphic, which shows playoff teams right now. And this comes from Football Insights, which is another awesome account that I would recommend everybody to follow. You can see that the Washington Commanders, 29.6% cover 1, 3.5% cover 0, 3% cover 2 man. Highest rate next to the Detroit Lions in the playoffs. And so Washington, no stranger to playing man coverage against opposing offenses. So you have Jared Goff against a coverage where he and this offense have just absolutely thrived all season long. But what I find interesting in this is that Jared Goff, especially down the stretch, and the Detroit Lions have actually faced a lot of very heavy zone coverage teams. So it's been a long time since we've seen Jared Goff get a team that throws a lot of man coverage at him. A lot of this has to do with the division that the Lions play in. Green Bay, Minnesota, Chicago, 6 games of their schedule each season. Those teams are all heavy zone coverage teams. They're zone first teams, and they do not play a lot of man coverage. Down the stretch, you think about the games that Goff and the Lions played as well. Buffalo is a team that plays a lot of zone coverage and doesn't play a whole lot of man. San Francisco, as we've known for several years, is a very zone-heavy team that doesn't play a lot of man. And Gus Bradley and the Indianapolis Colts, one of the highest zone coverage rates in the entire NFL as well. So this idea and truth and fact that Jared Goff is so great against man coverage hasn't been something that we've seen a lot of, especially down the stretch. And I don't want to say that the Lions offense can be suppressed, but I think there is an element that we haven't seen Goff against man coverage in a very long time. The last time we saw Goff and the Lions play a defense that is overwhelmingly a man coverage defense was the Jacksonville Jags, who played man coverage at the number 1 rate in the NFL. The Detroit Lions put up 52 points in that game, and I think it was nearly 700 yards of total offense. It was absurd how easy it was for the Lions to move the football up and down the field that entire game against the Jags. Can Dan Quinn come out and throw a big curveball? Perhaps. I don't know if I buy it because Dan Quinn's entire season has been about aggression and staying consistent and sticking with the same process. And so I don't think we're going to see just this drastically different game plan from the Washington Commanders that is going to completely catch the Lions off of the bye off guard. I'm just not buying into that. And so I think this is going to be an opportunity for Jared Goff to have a massive game throwing the football. I think the Lions offense is going to move the football very consistently and very comfortably and have a ton of success. Now we're seeing a total in this game of 55 points. It's as big of a total as you would come to expect for a playoff game, especially in the divisional round. It's indoors. You have two great offenses. All the reasons are obvious to see why the total is this high. But there's a consistent talking point around the Lions defense and Aaron Glenn that you're going to hear a lot about and probably maybe have already this week, but certainly if not leading into the game and kickoff on Saturday. And that is Aaron Glenn and this Lions defense against mobile quarterbacks. So I tried to put some numbers to it because it's very common. If you listen to the podcast, you've heard it referenced a ton. It's something that we heard in pressers, and it's such a prevalent point among the Lions fan base that a Lions reporter went up to Dan Campbell this week and asked him about it. And Dan Campbell had to come out and defend it early in the week, saying that, well, every team struggles against mobile quarterbacks. We're not unique, and we'll have a game plan for it. Well, say what you will about it. The Lions have allowed a league-high 445 total rushing yards to opposing quarterbacks this season. The big reason that this happens, going back to the coverage chart, is because the Detroit Lions play a ridiculously high rate of man coverage. And when you're putting your DBs and secondary in a lot of man coverage, what happens is their backs are turned to the opposing quarterback. And you find that quarterbacks have a lot of running lanes to get open and find space to have success. So not only have the Lions allowed the most rushing yards to quarterbacks this season, if we think back the last two seasons with Aaron Glenn in this defense, last year, some massive games conceded, 58 and 104 to Fields, 36 to Lamar. And that's a very misleading number because the Ravens had such a big lead early that he didn't have to run. And then 45 in the opener to Mahomes. There was also the Geno Smith game where Aaron Glenn took it upon himself in the midweek presser to be like, Geno worries us as a mobile quarterback. Geno should worry a lot of teams about his mobility. He just never runs. But Aaron Glenn was concerned enough about it, and Geno had a key run in that game. We go back to 2022. Fields, again, 147 and 132 in those two games. Josh Allen, 78 yards. And Jalen Hurts, 90 yards rushing. So Aaron Glenn and his defense continuously struggles against this. Obviously, Jaden Daniels is identified as a mobile quarterback. I'm not breaking any ground here saying that this is going to be something that the Lions are aware of and have to prep for. I'm just trying to illustrate the path here that this Commanders offense that is so dependent, especially down the stretch on Jaden Daniels and his legs, is probably going to have opportunities to find big plays in the run game against this Lions defense. Now, when I think about just the game as a whole, I question whether or not this is a year early for the Washington Commanders and whether this is, as great as Jaden Daniels has been and as much as he's elevated this team, just timing-wise, is there enough to overcome being a team like this in the divisional round to earn a win on the road against the Super Bowl favorite Detroit Lions? And it reminds me of recent teams we've seen in past seasons since we've gone to the format change in the playoffs. So think about this Washington Commanders team. First-year staff, rookie quarterback, 6.5 preseason win total. It's a massive overachievement. You win 12 games. You win the playoff game on the road at Tampa Bay. I mean, it's a massive victory for everybody this year in the Washington organization. Exact same scenario and very similar talking points to Houston last year. First-year staff, rookie quarterback, 5.5 game win total in the preseason. Overachieve, get to the playoffs. You win your opening game against the Cleveland Browns. What happens that next week? Go on the road to Baltimore, 34-10 blowout loss. Think back to 2022. Seems like it was a long time ago, a lifetime ago. New York Giants start the season, preseason win total, 6.5 wins, shaded to the over. First-time coaching staff. You don't have the rookie QB, but it's a brand new offense. It's a brand new team. Expectations very low. You get to the playoffs. It's a big surprise. It's a big win. There's awards won. You win the playoff game against the Minnesota Vikings. It's a big celebration. Everybody's pumped. Everybody's happy. What happens next week? You go on the road to Philadelphia and get smoked 38-7. Now, I'm not calling for a 3 to 4 score blowout here for the Detroit Lions. I do think there's a chance that we see blowout potential come from this matchup just because of how one-sided it might be. But again, is this just a year too early for Jaden Daniels and for the Washington Commanders? I think it's a fair question. And the reason that I lean towards it being a little bit too early is just referencing luck metrics. And so here is a tweet that I think is worth bringing up as we look at this. And the banner, I'm going to switch out in a second, but there's some noise in the Commanders' performance. So first half of the season, they would be compared to the best New England Patriots offenses with Tom Brady. I mean, it was a crazy comparison for what we were looking at and how much they were getting credit for that I don't think anyone ever believed and everybody thought was overly deserving. And so we saw that kind of fall off and come back to earth at least a little bit. When you think about number 1 in EPA per play for the first half of the season, in the second half, they've dropped all the way to number 15. It's best in the league to league average. For the entire season on early downs, they've been 10th in EPA per play. On late downs, they're number 1 in EPA per play. It's long been established that early down success is far more predictive and far more sustainable for an offense over the course of the season than late down success is. And when we're looking at just how much the Washington Commanders offense with Jaden Daniels has overperformed on late downs, the only team since 2018 that has generated a higher EPA per play on late downs was the 2028 Chiefs than that record-setting year. I don't know if anybody is ready to put the Washington Commanders this year on that same level as that 2018 Chiefs team. It's just a massive leap, and it shows how dependent the Commanders have been on these late downs going their way. Number 1 in terms of fourth down conversion rate, the most fourth down conversions in NFL history. And we're also seeing the highest number of points scored on drives of any team in NFL history with a fourth down conversion on those drives. So a lot's been going that way. Now, when we get into win probability added from luck metrics specifically, that's where things start to look very interesting. When we look at Washington, they've added 185.5% from luck stats over the regular season. So that's nearly 2 wins have been added to the Commanders season from things like dropped interceptions by opponents, dropped passes by wide receivers and tight ends on opposing teams, field goal luck, fumble recoveries. Everything for the course of the season has gone heavily in favor of the Washington Commanders when it comes to these luck metrics. And they're performing in these luck and high leverage situations at a rate that we haven't seen, albeit from one team, dating back way back in 2018 that was a historically great offense. And so as we come full circle on this game, you have a very good offensive matchup for the favorite in this game that has proven they're a very good front runner when they have a lead against a weaker defense that plays a scheme that the offense can feast on. You have a mobile quarterback that can certainly elevate the underdog's offense to stay competitive and find big plays against a defensive scheme in Detroit that has struggled a lot. But this is perhaps a year early for this Washington team, for this Washington staff. And there's just been a lot of bounces going the right way for Washington all season long. And now that has to work on the road in a much different scenario and a much different environment than how we saw it work last week on the road against Tampa Bay. And there's just something to be said when you think about this coaching staff matchup and how Detroit knows. I mean, the next time the Lions lose is the last game we'll see Glenn and Johnson on either side as a coordinator for this staff in all likelihood. It just seems like these two teams are on different levels at this time. And that is how I'm looking specifically at this one. Matthew says Jaden Daniels' scrambling ability explains some of that late down success. It's repeatable. So on the fourth down specifically, he's actually used his arm more than he has used his legs to pick up conversions. It's about 60% passing versus 40% rushing specifically for those. I think this is a good discussion point and a good talking point. It's like, how sustainable is this? There's studies that have been done, whether it's Warren Sharp's study about early down versus late down success. There's been other football analytics websites that have dove into, like, is third down and fourth down success repeatable? The overwhelming answer is no, and that there's a lot of noise in it. And I think the best possible comparison that I can think of for Washington would be Baltimore back when Lamar took over as the starting quarterback. And remember how aggressive Baltimore was with all their third and fourth down decisions. Harbaugh was getting all the praise for it, and Baltimore was hitting at a ridiculous rate. Well, if you look at Washington this year, not only have they gone for it on fourth down a lot more times, not only have they converted a lot more fourth downs, the difference between the Commanders' fourth down conversion rate and like Lamar breaking into the NFL and taking the NFL by storm, the difference between those two is a little bit higher than 20%. And so not only is there a data proving that like this is not sustainable long term, but at like the rate the Commanders are overperforming what a reasonable expectation would be is pretty crazy. And like you're putting it in historical context. And like this is like I can't get there with Washington being 2018 Chiefs great, 2008 Patriots great, 2018 and 2019 Ravens great. I'm not ready to say that this team is on that level. And so you're right that Jaden Daniels and his legs and his ability is certainly elevating this offense to a standard that is deserving of praise and should be improving on numbers that they've had in the past. It's just got to a pretty extreme level, is how I would sit at this. And so it goes both ways, but I think there's a lot to look at it in that perspective and consider going back over the past time. Rudy's pumped about the graphics, says he's a visual learner. Hopefully you take away from that. That'll be good to see as well. Question specifically from Michael B. A question for next season. Do you have any information on who the unluckiest teams are? That's a great off-season video topic that I will definitely talk about. T. Moss is late, but here. Good to have you. I don't know if you're joining live. I don't know if you're starting at the front. You're dropping in a comment about KC. That's great to see. So I think you're catching up. By the time you catch up to this comment, welcome to the live stream. Good to have you as well. And so Washington, Detroit 33-23 is how I'm looking at that game specifically. I'm going to go out of order. I'm breaking the rules. I'm going to go Baltimore, Buffalo, because I have a lot more to talk about on this game than I do the Rams, Eagles. I know it's out of order, but I'll keep the best info flowing first, and then we'll get to the Rams, Eagles, which I have a lot less on than this game specifically. Still a lot to talk about, but this game, I think, much more entertaining. So score prediction for me, Buffalo 27, Baltimore 24. This is the one game of the week that has weather concerns, cold, chance of snow. I saw that it was labeled by Kevin Roth as a yellow-orange, which means weather impact. To put in perspective, cold weather alone, if you're looking at games that have between 5 and 25 degrees Fahrenheit at kickoff, the biggest impact is on the passing game. You see a 5 to 8% dip in passing performance because of the cold. Isn't a big impact on running the football. There isn't a big impact on overall offense, but passing and deep passing, you see take a dip. As we always say here on the podcast, the biggest impact for football and weather is wind. So I bring that up because the total's 51. Everybody knows what the weather is. We haven't seen much under money, if any at all, into the market yet. Not saying it's not going to come, but just to put the weather in perspective, the cold has been known for a couple of days, even dating back to last week. There hasn't been that buy on the under. That could come late. We'll see. But that puts the weather and the cold in perspective for what you're looking at in this game specifically. I think part of the reason we haven't seen a lot of under money is because both of these teams are incredibly efficient at running the football, and that's going to be a big part of the game plan. Lots of talking points for this game. Let's go at them one by one. Let's start with the Ravens defense. Big question is it a turnaround or is it schedule? Alex Rollins, a couple days ago here on YouTube, had a great video about the schematic changes that the Baltimore Ravens made and the impact that it has been having on the defense since week 12. To put numbers into context, week 1 to 11, the Baltimore Ravens defense 21st in EPA, 10th in success rate. Week 12 to 18 down the stretch, number 1 in EPA per play, number 1 in success rate. A massive increase in defensive performance. Kyle Hamilton got moved to safety rather than being used closer to the line of scrimmage. Williams was benched. Jackson was waived. Washington's play was elevated. A lot of changes that Zach Orr finally made to the defense have had a drastic improvement for how this defense has played. The big question becomes, is this entirely personnel or is this schedule? Weeks 1 to 11, of the 11 games that the Ravens played, they faced 6 top 10 offenses in terms of EPA per play ranking. Weeks 12 to 18, the Ravens played just one top 10 offense. The rest were all near the bottom of the league. So, schematic change, very obvious, very evident, very telling. But schedule down the stretch has been pretty light. Now, the same thing can be said for the Buffalo Bills and how their defense has performed. I tend to believe that this is more drastic improvement than it is just noise of schedule, because there's like a tangible scheme change that can be pointed at that makes a lot of sense as to why it has changed. And as we just talked about, like, the change has been significant. But I do buy into a little bit of a case saying that, hey, this Ravens defense might not be number 1 in both categories, especially against the Bills offense that is going to be the best offense that they have faced in several weeks. So we might see this Ravens defense that is being lauded as being dominant and number 1, and Zach Orr overcoming the losses, multiple defensive coaches and figuring it out. Maybe that's being overblown a little bit. I'm not dismissing it. I'm not criticizing it. I'm not talking against it. Perhaps there's just a little bit of overblown element to that. So that would be talking point number 1 that I see. Talking point number 2 that is going to be brought up a lot about this game that I think is going to have an impact is thinking back to the first meeting. The Baltimore Ravens bullied the Buffalo Bills, and they got whatever they wanted on the ground. They ran for 8 yards per carry. However, the Bills were down multiple defensive starters. So in that week 4 game, they allow 8 yards per carry, but they played that game without Milano, without Johnson, without Bernard. Early in the game, they lost Rapp. It was a ravaged defense that lost a lot of key pieces when it comes to defending the run. Everybody is talking about those guys returning and the Bills defense automatically being elevated and having a chance to look a lot better in this game. Here's some numbers to it. The Bills with and without Milano, 4.1 yards per carry versus 5.1 without. Without Johnson, 4.6 carries with him, 5.1 without. So you're seeing a 1.5 yard difference between having those guys on and off the field when it comes to stopping the run. It makes a difference. It matters. It's going to look, in all likelihood, different for the Buffalo Bills having all of these guys back on the field for the game against the Ravens on Sunday night. I think there's a chance that the Bills go even a little bit further to sell out and stop the run, especially if Zay Flowers is still not 100%. And they obviously know what's coming and they have personnel back. What I would say as a bit of a caveat to this, Matt Milano's performance, being viewed as the key guy in this, from a PFF grading perspective, has been pretty abysmal since he returned. Has not looked at all like the guy he has been. He's coming off his best performance by far since returning last week against the Denver Broncos, but his numbers so far since returning have been night and day. And in terms of grading, he's been one of the 30 worst at his position since coming back. And so it's been a drastic shift for what we come to expect. In many ways, comparatively to Williams has outperformed Milano by a significant amount in terms of on-field numbers over the course of the season. But there is this historical comparison context that Milano on and off the field for the Bills, I mean, it's night and day when you look at those numbers. His on-off splits are significant. Another thing that I would say is this Bills defensive group, and the one that is going to be tasked with selling out to stop the run, is undersized. And visually, you can see it when you're watching this team against bigger opponents and bigger O-lines. They're just smaller. They're very aggressive at trying to stop the run. At times when they sell out, they can be really good at doing it. Size-wise, it's notable at how undersized they can be. And where I think that's going to be important in this game is thinking about the Ravens from 22 personnel. Henry, Ricard blocking up front. I mean, if Johnson is down in the box trying to get in the lane and it's him at sub 200 pounds going up against 300-pound plus Ricard, I mean, that's a major mismatch in favor of the Baltimore Ravens. You have Andrews and Likely as well as the two tight ends, but also Charlie Kolar is back as well, and he's a great blocking tight end that the Ravens can utilize. And so the Ravens have a bit of a cheat on offense when they're going to be running from 22 personnel. They've used it 13% of snaps this season, which is the highest of any team in the NFL. When the Ravens use 22 personnel, 2 running backs, 2 tight ends, they gain 0.43 EPA per pass and 0.13 EPA per rush. Those numbers are ridiculously high comparative to what standard offenses will run. And when you look at how bad the Bills are at defending it, 0.52 EPA per pass allowed, 0.16 EPA per rush allowed, those numbers are comparatively worse than how efficient the Ravens are at gaining it. So there's an expectation in this game that when the Ravens go to 2 tight ends and 2 backs, they should probably have more success than they have this season. That's a scary thing for the Bills defense, especially if the Ravens are going to try throw a little bit more from it. And the big problem with this for Buffalo is they're playing so many snaps in nickel, and it kind of pushes that undersizing a little bit further. And so what is the defensive change going to be for Buffalo? Is this going to be going to more base and bringing an extra backer on the field to combat this and taking a chance with Lamar beating you, throwing, especially if, say, Flowers is dinged up? Or are the Bills going to attack this a different way? The one thing that I would say in this is there's a couple paths the Bills can go, and they don't look great. But like Sean McDermott in big games as a defensive coach, I think is incredibly underrated for some of the game plans, for some of the curveballs, for some of the tweaks that he could throw at opposing offenses they don't see coming. And this is it. Like, this is the game where it's all opened up and let out. And there's just so much known about this Ravens offense, and there's so much established that I think the advantage here is with McDermott throwing a curveball to catch the Ravens off guard. And I'm buying into that happening. On paper, it doesn't look great. The matchups don't make it look great. I think McDermott comes through with something in this matchup. Now, on the offensive side of the football, again, is the Ravens defense potentially overrated? I think that's a fair question. I see the Bills with one very clear path and very clear option. And that is, when it comes to it, you have to throw up Brandon Stephens on key downs. He has to be the target of this offense when yards are needed to try find big plays, because they're not going to have a lot of success going many other directions. And to put it in perspective, here's Brandon Stephens. 63% success rate allowed when targeted, 0.54 EPA per target when a quarterback's throwing a football at him. His coverage grade on PFF is 175 of 223 defensive backs. In comparison to the other guys, Marlon Humphrey, number 5 of 223. Wiggins, 57 of 223. And when looking at the safety position, Kyle Hamilton is number 5 of 170. So how are the Bills going to find opportunities to isolate and target Brandon Stephens? Might be with Hollins, might be with Shakir. There's paths that they can go. The Ravens obviously know their weakness is Stephens on defense, and they try to line him up on the side of the field where you kind of have Hamilton shaded over and there's less space, so it's not just a wide side isolation where you can pick on him in man coverage. So the Ravens play around it, but like we saw the Steelers last week find explosives when targeting him. It's been the case for weeks all season. When you're throwing at Stephens, you're having success. And I think obviously Buffalo is going to know this, but the way that we've seen the deep ball, especially with Allen on the move, kind of come back into play for this Bills offense down the stretch of the season, we're going to see big plays with him getting outside, targeting whichever receiver they have on Stevens, finding ways to get open. And I think that's a big advantage that the Bills have to exploit, that the Ravens can't necessarily cover up and find. This is going to be an awesome game to watch. It's going to be incredibly fun. I think the Bills end up winning by a field goal late. I think it's going to be a very back and forth competitive game. And this is going to come down to Sean McDermott with what will need to be the best defensive game plan that he has had of his entire career. And that is how I look at this game specifically. Connor is saying, you picking totals that fall directly on the number is infuriating. It's not intentional. It's the NFL Divisional Round. It is what it is. You're getting scoreline predictions, and that's how I look at it. If you're going to put me on the spot for some leans at the end of the show, get back in the comments. I'll give you some commentary on like which way I'm looking at, which way I'm leaning as well. Slay the Beast says Brandon Stevens is trash. The slander is existing in the chat as well. They should make Nate Wiggins a starter. Joe Winter says Josh Allen rushing yards consistently uses his legs in high leverage games. I think that's true. We're seeing his closing price higher than we've seen it all regular season. So it's being priced in. That's there. I cannot disagree with the sentiment, though. Like, I wouldn't want to be betting on the under for a Josh Allen running game in a playoff game like this, where there's absolutely opportunity for him to find some space. Final game of the game, but earlier game on Sunday. LA Rams on the road at the Philadelphia Eagles. Eagles 6-point favorites with a total of 44. 24-19 Eagles win is my scoreline prediction. This is a very difficult game to gauge, very difficult game to handicap, a very difficult game to see a lot. I felt the same with the Eagles last year as well. Two talking points that I have for this game that I think stand out most. The first is, are the Rams going to do what I think is the obvious thing and sell out as much as they can to stop the run? I think the only chance that the Rams have of being close to cover the number or have a chance of pulling off the upset is doing everything possible defensively to sell out to stop the run. In Week 12, when these two teams played, LA allowed 314 rushing yards to the Philadelphia Eagles. Saquon Barkley ran for 255 and 2 touchdowns. It was his best game of the season by far. The reason that I believe the Rams have to sell out to stop the run, again, not saying anything obvious, it's just how I view the game, is because they're traditionally a team that plays a lot of too high safety looks, which against the Philadelphia Eagles are just going to be killed. They have to throw a change up. Maybe it's more cover one, dedicating extra guys down to the box. They have to do it. But I think the underlying question in this game is, where do we look at Jalen Hurts being physically and mentally, and what are we doing gauging this Eagles passing offense? Last week, coming off of the concussion and the extra rest, Jalen Hurts finished the game with a 35% passing success rate. That was the lowest passing success rate of any quarterback who won a playoff game in the last 10 years. That ranks 205, that 35% success rate number, of 224 quarterback performances in the last decade of the NFL. And I give credit to Philly Special Podcast for pointing that out as a stat that is very damning for the Philadelphia Eagles offense. It goes beyond the A.J. Brown book stuff on the sideline, which is odd enough. But like tying into everything that you're seeing and everything you're hearing, I just can't help but wonder, like, what are we getting from this Eagles passing game? The Rams defense against the Vikings looked great up front with this young defensive front. If it's an overcommittal to say, look, we're not giving up those 50-plus yard runs to Barkley, you're going to have to beat us throwing. There's a chance that the Rams corners can win. It's not a high chance, but if we see this, like there's some underlying issue that's really prevalent that can't be disguised by the run game, and it's all on Jalen Hurts, I think that's the best out for the Rams defense. You have to take that chance that he's maybe not 100%. You're seeing, as we talked about last week, that lingering impact of QBs coming back from concussions. It has an impact on play, and it's documented in how that play falls off and it's less effective. If there's something there and you're the Rams defense and you're Shula as the DC, you got to go down gambling and say, we're not going to let Barkley beat us. If Hurts is going to beat us throwing the Brown, or Smith, who wasn't there for the first matchup, so be it. But we're going to take our chances. And if you're buying into the Rams doing that, and doing that effectively, and you think that there's something really wrong with this Eagles passing offense, I can see how you're looking at the Rams getting 6, maybe as a tempting side. On the other side of the ball, I think the big talking point is, can the Eagles make up for the loss of Nakobe Dean? The Vic Fangio defense for the Eagles has been phenomenal all season long, and it's still a top-rated defense in this NFL. But last week, they lost defensive leader and green dot Nakobe Dean at the linebacker position. He's coming off of a career year where he had 128 tackles for the team in 15 games played. That was second to Bond, who had over 150. Like, massive part of this offense, massive part of getting guys lined up, massive part of pre-snap adjustments, but also a massive part of handling motion from opposing offenses. Where I think this becomes an interesting matchup for the Rams specifically is LA this season with Sean McVay is number 1 in pre-snap motion. When they use pre-snap motion, they're 1.4 yards per play better than snaps when they do not. And they have an 8% higher success rate on offensive plays when they're using motion. Everything that's written and spoken about when it comes to the Sean McVay offense by film analysts, by reporters, by team and staff members is about how his motion and his motion concepts that are used to layer in plays with the offense are all about putting opposing linebackers in a bind and forcing opposing linebackers to make a decision. With Dean out as the green dot, there's obviously going to have to be shuffling into how plays are managed pre-snap and how everybody's lining up. But there's also question as the Eagles are signing linebackers this week about like who is going to step in and how big of the drop is it going to be from Dean to whichever linebacker the Eagles elect to put in his place for the majority of snaps. I think there's a big question mark for how Fangio is going to handle that. And there's certainly a path to where the Rams have an advantage that they use so much in their offense to try target that new weakness that may exist for this very fundamentally sound and very dominant Philadelphia Eagles defense. Now, the big way that the Eagles can just negate this and make this not a problem is to get the ground game going and have a lead. And quite frankly, at that point, the motion for LA becomes less effective and it might not matter. In the first game, we saw the Rams very effective out of the gate with the scripted play. They had the turnover in the red zone, and that just flipped the game. And then the Eagles were able to build a lead. The Rams had a couple of bad drives, and the game was over at that point. The Rams could never catch up. Eagles have been starting slow all season long, so maybe this is a game where McVay puts priority on the script. That might provide them a bit of an advantage. But if this is a game where the Eagles get a lead and it negates some of the effectiveness of that motion and what McVay wants to do on offense and targeting those linebackers because it becomes more of a known passing down situation, this could get away from LA in a hurry. Matthew Stafford over the course of the season, when kept clean in the pocket, ranks top 5 for most key passing metrics. He's been great when kept clean. But what's been surprising is Matthew Stafford, who for his career has been excellent when pressured, has all of a sudden started to fall off the last couple of seasons. And this year, when pressured, he's been a bottom 5 quarterback. Now, in the first meeting, the Rams didn't have the right tackle, Havenstein. He's going to be back for this game playing. So it's going to be potentially a difference, obviously, when you have a key piece of your offensive line up front. But if this gets out of hand for the Eagles and they get going downhill and they have an ability to kind of negate the motion and they can throw pressure and it's Fangio with his disguised coverages, that's going to be a scenario, I think, where we could see Stafford struggle and this Rams offense kind of get shut down in ways that it did for chunks of the first game between these two teams. And so as I think about this, again, I just like last week, like it wasn't a strong opinion either side. Like it's a really hard game to handicap. It's a really hard game to look at. It's a really hard game to see the number and think there's a big advantage as well. And I don't have a great stance or like a lot more to say specifically about this game and what we're looking at. And I'm old and steady. Preseason Super Bowl prediction was Chiefs-Eagles. I think certainly as it stands here, the Eagles with potential to win the game as a 6-point favorite, obviously. I'm not deviating from that prediction, but I see two very narrow paths here for the Rams on offense and defense to make this close and have a chance of pulling the upset. Otherwise, it just seems like there's a lot of avenues here for the Philadelphia Eagles. 4-game shows are pretty great to get through. You can spend more time on them. You can do the graphics, which seem to be enjoyed in the chat as well. If you're watching this after the fact and you're in the comment section, what do you think of the graphics? If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, again, didn't get to see the graphics, you can head over to YouTube, but I think I did a good part of combining the two for this show specifically to give everybody insights into things that they need. And so before we go, if you guys have any questions to wrap up, as we're at the 50-minute mark of the show, which is the quickest show by far of the entire season, I'll do my best job to answer them. You can drop them in the live chat. If you're watching after the fact, you can drop them in the comments, and I will be answering them in the comments all week long leading up to the games on Saturday or Sunday as well. For us over on the service, we did have a release earlier in the week. I won't get into what that was specifically, as we'll kind of keep things quiet now down the stretch. I don't know if that'll be the final release of the NFL service for the year. We'll see if we have maybe one more between the conference championships and the Super Bowl. Next week, specifically for streaming, I'll do a show Sunday evening to react to the conference championship opening lines as we do. I'll do that following the Bills and Ravens games on YouTube, and it will be uploaded to Apple and Spotify as well. So if you're not subscribed to the channel, you can hit the subscribe button to get the notification of when that goes live. If you've enjoyed the show and you've been watching this already, hit the thumbs up. If you're on Apple or Spotify, we'd really appreciate it if you take a second to rate and review the podcast, leave a note. I see Spotify is rolling out a ton of features, which I'll get into next year as well for the podcast and try elevate that a little bit further. Apple, as always, you can leave the comment, you can leave the review as well. Michael, for player props specifically, I don't expect us to have a release on the service for any props. And so if that is clear by the end of the week and nothing is sent out, in the pinned comment, I know it's been away for the last couple of weeks because there was some back and forth about it being detrimental to the service, which probably was an overstep by my part, sharing things that were not releases. And so that's why the pinned comment has gone away, just to protect things for subscribers. But if nothing is deemed good enough for a release, I'll post in the pinned comment below. And I think this is a week where we can probably have a little bit of fun with some expanded SGPs or try to take a few flyers with a few longer shots as well. Waiting to see markets populate a little bit more. I know a lot of stuff is up, but Michael, later in the week, I'll post in the pinned comment section. May also have a TGL take for week 3 as well that I'll post in the comment section as well. So I'll just wait till later in the week to clear there's no releases, and then I'll share some prop thoughts as well. I know last week we talked about Ty Johnson. We talked about Joe Mixon as well. Earlier in the Buffalo breakdown of this game, referenced Mac Hollins, but I haven't seen many numbers for him, and I'm not sure what would be good or bad there specifically too. Same thing, Joe. I'll keep everybody updated if there's no releases on what we get to with any props. I'll post them in the pinned comment section down below here on the YouTube video. Joe Ross says, terrific. Thank you. Really throw out stuff for the move. Otherwise, you'll move it and then throw it out. We've been posting on Facebook Marketplace, and that has been an experience. Yesterday, we're on a ground floor unit, and we sold an espresso machine for like $80. And there was a guy that came to pick it up, and he's like, I'm driving half an hour to get it. Wait for me. So I said, sure. And so we're on a ground floor, like corner unit, right at like a semi-busy intersection. And there's 2 parking spots. And he said, I'm here. I opened the door, and both of the spots were taken. And there was a guy walking a dog down at the corner. So I'm out there in the cold holding this espresso machine and slippers. And I'm like, well, I don't know where the guy is. So I came back in to reply to the message and be like, I'm out front. Come meet me. He was the guy walking the dog. So the guy showed up. I'm not exaggerating. This pit bull that he came with, I mean, it had to be 150 pounds, easy. I mean, just the thick, like a barrel on stilts walking through. And so his move to not get mugged on these Facebook Marketplace show-ups, which is a new experience for me, was just show up with the biggest pit bull you have ever seen. And I mean, nobody's taking advantage of that. So here we are, I'm in slippers exchanging things with the guy, and he's holding a leash for this gigantic pit bull. And what an experience. And so we are getting rid of some stuff for sure. But man, Facebook Marketplace, you get some pretty crazy scenarios that show up from that as well. Cottage, I don't know why I got in that tangent, but it caught me off guard yesterday. Cottage 11100. If you are choosing an alt line, which team is most likely to blow someone out? Lions, question mark. Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with the Lions. I would say alt price wise and just kind of like outcome you can possibly get. Maybe the Bills, you're probably going to get better prices. Like, could I see the Bills winning by 7 to 10? Yes. Is that more likely than the Lions winning by 24 plus? Maybe kind of in like the same category, but it's like, is the Lions defense that struggles against mobile QBs with Washington chasing more likely to get inside that range than the Bills winning by more than a touchdown? So I would compare that, but I would say, yes, Lions 1, Bills 2 is how I would look at that question. Anthony is asking, what is the most likely upset this weekend? Bills is a cop-out answer, Anthony. I would be very surprised if Houston goes into KC and wins. I'd be very, very surprised if Washington goes into Detroit and wins. Like default answer is the Bills because they're dogs, and I don't necessarily agree with that. But the answer to that question would be the Rams specifically, is maybe you get the clunker game from Hurts, is how I would look at it. Connor, no idea on the Pit Bulls. Vic. We're also seeing, I don't know what I always prep my camping gear. There we go. Good joke on that one as well. But yeah, I don't know how I got to the Pitbull story, but here we are it's late in the season. We're ready to go. Vince, I see the numbers for those two props specifically. Again, if there's any prop updates and we don't have a release on any props, I will post them in the pinned comment section. Check Saturday morning is, I think, a fair time for when they'll be up, like 11, 12 p.m. Pacific, just before games kick off. If we don't have any releases by then, that's when it'll go out. But at a minimum, I'll post like a fun long shot SGP that we can sweat out collectively for a few games as well. Last question from Joe English. Would you prefer to bet any team to win the Super Bowl as opposed to a money line parlay on their 3 games? Great question. Comes up a lot. My viewpoint on this has been the same for a long time. And I go back to the Atlanta-New England year, where I think one of the best futures I ever bet was the Falcons in week 16 to win the Super Bowl. It obviously didn't win. But the reason I go back to that game is I think it's a perfect example. You have to think about this in 2 different ways. If you're betting a future, you are never going to get a better return in all likelihood than if you're betting the money line rollover. But there's a critical difference in how you handicap and how you value the price in both of those. If you're just going by like, what's going to give me a bigger payout at the end, the answer 99 out of 100 times is going to be the money line rollover. But if you're betting the money line rollover, you're betting it because the team you are picking in the money line rollover is expected to face the most difficult path to get to the outcome. So, for example, if you're betting the Buffalo Bills to win the Super Bowl and you're doing it on a money line rollover, you're betting that effectively the Chiefs and the Lions are both going to win out, because in order to maximize the money line rollover, you need the path to get to the Super Bowl to win to be the most difficult. Because if it's the easiest, then your money line rollover is going to pay less. If you're betting the future, you're doing it because you see value relative to the path that they're going to take, which you're projecting to be easier than the price on the future price is reflecting. I always see these discussions come up, and it's like end talking point, money line rollover pays more. If you're betting futures, you're dumb. I don't agree with that. And because the way I handicap is looking at the opposite. Like, I'm not looking at teams that are going to have a difficult path to get to where they're going. And if that's the case, I don't really want to bet a future on them. And so my only comment on that would be to think about the difference in the path that you need to maximize either of those bets. And then the other thing obviously would be, is you're betting a future, you're building equity going forward. Whereas on the money line parlay, you have to keep betting to the end to get the realized gain in the comparative price. So that's my talking point on that specifically. Now, to be honest, Joe, we're at the point of the season where I mean, you're not going to find like massive variance between the two options just because there's so few games remaining, but perhaps something to think about going into next season. But that's how I view that money line rollover versus playing the future specifically. All right. Appreciate everybody again for stopping by. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe button down below, like button. Just double check if you've hit both, if you've been watching this throughout the duration of the stream. For everybody listening on the podcast, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's time, as always, tuning in, the comments you leave, the likes you leave, the live chat participation. You guys are the best. Appreciate it. And I will talk to each and every one of you again after Sunday Night Football to react to the opening lines for the conference championship weekend.